So, Dr. Callan, I'll now turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks very much, Devin, and thanks to everybody for coming tonight. I specialize in medieval Christian Europe, but I don't specifically specialize on the Black Death, which comes towards the end of the Middle Ages. In fact, some would say it's what ushered in the end of the Middle Ages, pointing to the possibility part of tonight's talk. The Middle Ages get called the Middle Ages because they stand between classical antiquity and modernity. And from a religion perspective, we date that as between 476, which is the traditional date for the fall of the Roman Empire, even though it fell before that and it got back up again afterwards, and then October 31st, 1517, which is the date that Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, thereby initiating the Protestant Reformation. But Martin Luther is a lot less revolutionary than people often think he is. Countless other heretics laid the groundwork for his successes over the previous several centuries. And what really enabled him to succeed, apart from the protection of Frederick of Saxony's army, was a development the previous century, the printing press. At the time of the plague, about 15% of the European population was literate. And it was an extremely arduous process to turn an animal into a book. You'd have to kill the animal and then scrape its skin, well, cut out its skin, and then scrape its skin of hairs, and then clean it off and dry it off and stretch it and cut and do all these things just to get the physical material that you'd make a book. And then you'd have to write it all out by hand. What the printing press enabled people to do was to standardize text much faster. So you could have much more consistent content, and you could also make the book much faster. I'd like to point out that the Chinese figured this out centuries before the Europeans. So this wasn't new for humanity, but it was new to Europe. I mention this not because it's particularly relevant for the plague, but because it's relevant for today. We too are in a time of transition right now where we can communicate with people all around the globe through a computer that fits in our pocket. The ability of Martin Luther to spread his ideas to those who would be receptive to his views was essential for the success of the Protestant Reformation and the end of the Middle Ages, in partnership with a million other developments. Just as our ability to share information, innovation, and ideas all around the world in seconds is contributing with a million other developments as we transition into a new age. Now, even amid COVID, the bubonic plague has been getting a lot of attention recently due to some outbreaks. But as a medievalist, I'll focus on its European first wave in the 14th century. I'll start with a basic who, what, why, when, where, and how of the plague before turning more specifically to the prejudice and possibility portions of tonight's talk. Each section is about 10 to 15 minutes, and I'll stop for some questions in between them. And I want to preface my comments with the awareness of how limited our sources are. As I mentioned, 15% of the population or less was literate at the time of the plague, and the vast majority of that 15% was male, and all were by definition extremely privileged. So we read the past through a very selective lens when we're fortunate enough to have surviving written records at all. In contrast, our current literacy rate in the United States is 99%, and we have some of the sharpest minds and greatest resources available to us in the world. And yet so much still remains unknown about our current pandemic, including pretty basic information. And a lot of what we thought we knew has turned out to be wrong. So if we know so little about our current circumstances, with all the resources we have available as we're currently living through it, consider how little we must know about the events of nearly 700 years ago. Hindsight might be 20/20, but only if the picture is complete. And this picture has a great many gaps in it. And not just because a third to a half of our potential witnesses died within days, if not hours, of coming into contact with this disease. But on to what we know of the medieval plague, or the great mortality, or the great pestilence. It went by a few names, and the most common name, the Black Death, was given to it only centuries later. This is a fairly standard transition map that you would see of the plague, and I do want to note that it glosses over an awful lot in the middle to skip from China to the Mideast and really Europe, reflecting the Eurocentrism of studies of the Black Death. what we think happened was there's some kind of earthquake or something in Mongolia or China that dislodged a number of rats, and more specifically the fleas that fed on them, and the rats had the Yersinia pestis bacterium that causes the Black Death. And then these fleas would they would be infected by the rats, and then they would bite humans, and they were traveling especially through the trade routes, and that's part of how it spread. The story of how it spread into Europe is a fascinating one. I will note that some scholars have called it into question, but it's a great story, so I'm sharing it. So I want to call your attention to Kaffa, which is this town right here, which was a Genoese trading outpost on the Black Sea, which was currently being besieged by Tatars. And they became stricken with the plague, and it caused them to withdraw. But before they did, they engaged in what has been called the first incidents of germ warfare. We have a pretty remarkable account telling us about the incident at Kaffa. And I'm not going to read it all to you, but I just want to call attention to the parts I've got highlighted here. And so you can see, it seems though it's coming down from heaven. You can see the swellings in the armpits are growing. So these are called the buboes that give it the name bubonic fever. And this is where you get to the so-called germ warfare, where the Tatars, before withdrawing, lobbed the plague-ridden corpses into the city of Kaffa via trebuchet. And if you don't know what a trebuchet is, there's an image of it up in the top right corner. If you reduce your Zoom images, you can maybe see it or move them around. But then also I have a demonstration with fire. So instead of fire, imagine plague-filled corpses, okay? Okay, so you can see that those would be used, trebuchets would mainly be used to try to, take out walls to remove defenses of so an invading army can enter. But what happened was they were lobbing these corpses in there. And again, some scholars have said they're not sure that's true, but we do have a pretty remarkable account of this happening from pretty close to the time itself by Gabriele de Musi. And it's believed that he heard this all from people who had fled from Kaffa. I also want to call attention to the ethnicities that I've got highlighted in blue there. You can see that Gabriele is recording that the plague decimated a number of different ethnicities and communities that don't show up on the map, the traditional map. And then in that last paragraph, he's talking about how the sailors who had been contracted plague themselves at Kaffa, they came back to Genoa, others went to Venice and to other Christian areas. By other Christian areas, he means other Western European areas. And they brought the plague with them everywhere they went, with an almost unimaginable mortality rate. This is a map showing the transmission of the plague throughout Western Europe, primarily, with some attention to the Middle East and Africa. And you can see that orange is signifying the earliest places that it hit, 1347, green, 1348, yellow, 1349, purple, 1350, and red, 1351. And the gray here might make you wonder, gee, what was Poland doing that was so right that they were relatively unaffected, as the Encyclopedia Britannica claims. The Encyclopedia Britannica is not thinking critically there. That is not to say that Poland escaped the plague. It's just a reflection of our surviving sources. But what sources that we do have suggest that it too would be purple and red, just like its neighbors. There were three main types of the plague. The one that gave it its name, bubonic, it would settle basically in the lymph nodes, and it caused these great swelling. And it had an 80 to an 85% mortality rate. And that is bad, especially when we talk about COVID-19 having a 3 to 5% mortality rate. You could see how much worse the bubonic plague, but it was the best of the three. You also have pneumonic, which had a 90 to 99% mortality rate, and it killed you very quickly. It was by far the most contagious form of the plague because it's the kind that is contagious through the droplets and aerosols we've heard so much about of late. And then you have the worst kind, the septicemic, which basically killed everybody, but on the positive side, it was quick. Often you would hear people were fine in the morning and then were dead by noon. Overall, Europe, the population is estimated to have lost about 40 to 60% of its people, but some communities were wiped out completely. At the start of the plague, or right before the start of it, the estimated population was about 150 million, which is more than Europe can comfortably sustain, or at least at that time. By 1353, it was reduced to 75 million. And the European population didn't recover to its pre-plague levels until the 17th century. It seems that every sector of society was equally hit. Plague, like God, was no respecter of persons, but I will also note that our records are primarily kept by the privileged class, who were a lot less invested in or informed about poorer communities, but that would have had less resources to resist, and also probably had more exposure to fleas, who were the main source of the contagion. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that we figured out the role of bacteria in causing plague. When medieval people basically understood this plague as having two main causes. The first is, of course, God, who allows it or sent it to punish sinners. And then the other is bad air, or miasma, which is the stench that's associated with the dead and dying and diseased. That was thought to be the source of the contagion. And that's why you see the plague doctor mask, which is an early modern, not a medieval phenomenon. This is from the early 17th century. And you see they wore this beak that they would stuff full of strongly scented flowers and herbs, sort of bringing their own fresh air supply with them. And they were also covered, wearing gloves and robe. They had their own, early modern equivalent of PPE. And that wasn't protecting them in the way that they thought it was, but it had a similar way of protecting them the way that our wearing masks and gloves and things would. This image over on the right side is also from the early 17th century, but it could have been describing the 14th century plague as well as our current circumstances. You have London being hard hit by the plague, and so you have people trying to flee the plague and go out into the countryside to get away from the plague, and the people in the countryside do not want them. This is what Boccaccio talks about in his Decameron, people leaving Florence in the same way, and as we saw, New Yorkers trying to escape COVID-19 and go into Connecticut or New Jersey or Maine or somewhere and not being completely welcomed. So this is a good point to stop and see if there are any questions. So do we have any questions, Devin?
We do not have any questions yet. I will reiterate to everyone participating, if you do have questions, you can type them into the chat and we will address them. There's another break after part 2. And then if we don't get to the questions at that point, we will address more questions at the end.
Okay, so thank you, Devin. So now we move into the second portion, which is the prejudice portion. And the worst prejudice, of course, wasn't against city folks by country folks. And I want to acknowledge that the image I'm going to be showing next, they're disturbing. Not that a grinning, dancing death and dying people isn't disturbing, but now we enter the realm of human hatred and violence inflicted upon other humans because of their own ignorance, bigotry, and fear. One of the most disturbing aspects, at least to me, especially about the later Middle Ages, is how pervasive Christian hatred and persecution of Jews was, which makes it ring exceptionally hollow when today's Christians claim that Nazis weren't real Christians and that Christianity had nothing to do with the Holocaust. One of the basic lessons of Christianity is that if you don't take responsibility for a sin, you can't repent for it, and you certainly can't be redeemed from it. It's true that some Nazis weren't Christian, but most Nazis were. And their hatred was fed by Christian scriptures, and it was built upon centuries of Christian persecution of Jews, including specifically in connection with the Black Death. One response to the plague, especially among communities in Germany that hadn't yet been exposed to the plague but could see it drawing ever near, was to target local Jews. Some Christians claimed the plague was caused by Jews poisoning wells, even though Jews died at similar rates as Christians. And so they preemptively burned them alive. It's estimated that 340 towns in Germany had pogroms and 80 Jewish settlements were wiped out entirely. And in case anyone is thinking that this is somehow uniquely a German thing, note that the English and the French had already expelled Jews from their kingdom, and the Jews didn't return to England until the 17th century. European Christian persecution of Jews has continued down to this day, with what often gets called anti-Semitic attacks on the rise, especially over the past 4 years in the United States. And some right now are blaming today's pandemic on a Jewish conspiracy, as Christian racists have blamed catastrophes on Jews essentially since their start. But the ones being most blamed for the virus are, of course, Asians, with even the president of the United States calling the disease Kung flu. Over 2,100 hate crimes against Asians have been reported in the United States just between February and June, with fears related to coronavirus combining with older prejudices about Asians plotting against Westerners, who are generally seen as generically white. When people speak of a pan-European white identity as if it's inherent, they often reveal their ignorance, not just about medieval European history, but also more recent American history. Those who identified with England dominated in the United States and jealously guarded whom they'd admit to their so-called Anglo-Saxon identity. Think of WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Even though modern inhabitants of England, let alone white Americans, have a tenuous connection with the Germanic tribes that invaded England starting in the 5th century. And England experienced a seismic change in 1066 with what's called the Norman Conquest. Now, this map depicts ethnic identities in the islands almost 5 centuries earlier, but it still works for the 11th century because those are the dominant groups with one more to add. So first you have the original Britons, who are better known as Welsh, which is a name that means foreigner, which was given to them by the invading Germanic tribes. So they were deemed foreigners by their invaders in their own lands. Then you have the Scots, and the term Scots for most of the Middle Ages referred to Irish people, including Irish people of Dalriada, which is this kingdom in Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. And then they later combined with the Picts into the new kingdom of Scotland. You have the Irish themselves in Ireland. You have the Anglo-Saxons, a Germanic blend intermingled with the blood of Britain's other inhabitants, the name Angles giving rise in English to English, whereas in their own languages, the Irish, Scottish, and Welsh refer to them and their increasingly ethnically mixed descendants as variants of Saxon. And then the new group, who's not shown here, are the Norse raiders, better known as Vikings, who in the 9th and subsequent centuries established strongholds on outlying islands as well as in certain cities. The Normans are related to the Norse. They are the descendants of Norse raiders who had settled in France and integrated so thoroughly into French Christian culture that when William, Duke of Normandy, invaded England, he did so as the Pope's chosen champion. Similar dynamics repeated a century later when William's great-grandson, Henry II, and his vassals invaded Ireland around 1169, initiating more of a colonization than a conquest that took more than the rest of the Middle Ages to complete. And this often gets called the English invasion of Ireland, but the invaders were an ethnic mix whose dominant language was French, and England itself continued to have what's called Englishry laws, legalizing discrimination against those identified as and speaking English into the mid-14th century, ending just a few years before the plague. The Normans saw the English in terms similar to how English colonists in what would become the United States regarded indigenous people here, with prejudice and contempt. Ethnicity is often perceived to be a product purely of genetics and ancestry, but it's a situational and strategic construct. a group's self-perception of its own identity informed by its culture, language, ancestry, and geographical location, among other factors, and defined in opposition to those seen as dangerously different, a threat to be eliminated, subdued, or avoided. Further illustrating the malleability of such identities, consider that William and his Normans invaded England with papal support, even though the Normans had converted to Christianity only in the previous century. Part of the terms for their settlement and what would become known as Normandy in France, which is over here. This is Normandy in France. And after centuries of raiding Christian communities throughout Britain, Ireland, and the continent's coast as the hated heathen Norsemen, the Vikings, who massacred monastic communities and enslaved the survivors. The English, on the other hand, had been Christians since at least the 7th century, partly thanks to the missionary work of the Irish, who had been Christians since the 5th century and served as missionaries in Britain as well as on the continent throughout the early Middle Ages. Yet in the 12th century, the papacy identified far more with the rulers of England than the people of Ireland and endorsed Ireland's invasion, saying the Irish had become false Christians and needed to be restored to the faith by Henry II, a man whose Christian failings are too many to name, but suffice it to say he's the guy responsible for the murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his own cathedral. And the Pope actually portrayed Ireland's invasion as part of Henry's penance for Becket's martyrdom. And this serves as a good reminder that the definition of Christian could depend on power and authority, not actual belief or behavior. And such is similarly true with ethnic identity, which frequently shifted, especially at broader levels. For much of the Middle Ages, people didn't think in terms of nationalities, but extended kin groups. England didn't even become a lasting unified kingdom until the century before William conquered it. When I first spoke of Europeans bringing the plague with them into Europe, I spoke of Genoese, not Italians, because Italy didn't exist as a country at that point, but as a collection of largely independent city-states, each with their own distinctive dialects and identities. And it's only in the mid-19th century that Italy became unified, adapting the 14th century Florentine dialect of Dante and Boccaccio, who was a key witness to the plague, especially in his Decameron, as the Italian language. As today's issues like Brexit, repeated efforts to establish Scottish independence, and continuing ethnic tensions related to Northern Ireland indicate, the people of the so-called United Kingdom aren't united and don't think of them simply as one people. Extending the example to Europe generally, 20th century European history, including its bloody world wars, makes the point unmistakable. Europeans aren't a unified people, let alone a race that generally gets called Caucasian. The term Caucasian is mostly meaningless when applied to anyone except those who originated from around the Caucasus region. It became the term for certain Western Europeans during 18th and 19th century racist attempts at anthropology. Up until relatively recently, some Western Europeans were deliberately excluded from the so-called race, especially the Irish and Highland Scots, along with Southern Europeans like Greeks and Italians, Eastern Europeans of any kind, including those with the most claim to the term Caucasian, and of course, a perennial European other, the Jews. White emerged as an invented ethnic identity primarily among the European mix that called the United States home, as differences between Europeans paled in comparison with their difference from non-Europeans, especially enslaved Africans and their descendants. But white is an identity that only goes skin deep. For more of this history, I especially recommend the work of Nell Irvin Painter, The History of White People. But being only skin deep doesn't stop that identity from being weaponized against others. As Ta-Nehisi Coates notes, race is the child of racism, not the father. People think race is genetically determined, but it's a construct created to justify pre-existing ethnic prejudice, especially in connection with the slave trade. Racism is a reality, but race is an invention to perpetuate prejudice and discrimination that prop up economic, military, and legal systems that allow dominant groups to exploit others based on perceived ethnic differences. This happened in medieval Europe, and it happens today. The term Black Death should reverberate especially among Europeans in the summer of 2020 as our country reckons with its racist legacy and its perpetuation, which disproportionately impacts Black Americans, including with respect to victims of COVID-19. And for those who want to better understand how race and racism have shaped this country, I especially recommend Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. As medievalist Mary Rambaran Olm has noted in her article, Black Death Matters, which takes inspirations for its name from the Black Lives Matter movement, profound parallels exist between the 14th century Black Death and 2020 America, connecting to both the plague and the possibility portions of tonight's talk. She raises such critical points that I quote her at even greater length than I did Gabriela de Musi, and I ask you to recall how Gabriela referenced a wide range of ethnicities being impacted by the plague, yet most maps and studies about the Black Death skip over those ethnicities, apart from the Chinese and Europeans entirely. As with Gabriela, I won't read the entire quote, but Dr. Rambaran Olm is critiquing the common view that is much more common among modernists than medievalists, that the plague ended feudalism and other oppressive aspects of the Middle Ages to enable society to progress into modernity, which often gets painted in a far more positive way. Consider, for example, how many people still call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, while the ways in which the plague increased persecution often gets ignored. As she says, the virus doesn't make distinctions between race and class, but we do, and that ends up costing lives. This pandemic has exposed this underbelly of racism, particularly in the West. She calls out medievalists for acting as if the 14th century plague impacted only Europeans, and white folks generally for whitewashing history and for perpetuating white supremacist capitalism, which especially oppresses people of color. She then names some recent Black deaths that have fueled massive support for the Black Lives Matter, even amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Racism is so toxic and pervasive that it too is a pandemic, and she closes by referencing some of the things its victims have been doing seconds before they became a headline, including sleeping, as Breonna Taylor was right before she was shot dead on March 13th, which was the last day Simpson had in-person classes due to the pandemic. She then invokes the last words of George Floyd, Eric Garner, Elijah McClain, Derek Scott, and too many others. I can't breathe. She closes with the point that while the plague of the 14th century may not have been a Black death in a literal sense, COVID-19 most certainly is one. As we reflect upon her words, we should also consider some statistics that support her analysis. As of July 21st, 2020, 1 in 1,350 Black Americans has died, which means they have a 7.37% mortality rate. People say 3 to 5% is the mortality rate. White Americans and Asian Americans are the only ones who are close to that 3%, and Black Americans are at over twice. Black Americans have the highest overall actual COVID-19 mortality rates, and if they had died of COVID-19 at the same actual rates as whites, about 17,000 Black people, 3,000 Latinos, 500 Indigenous Americans, and 50 Pacific Islander Americans would still be alive. And I know that's a heavy point, but that's a good breaking point for questions. So Devin, do we have any questions?
We do have a question. This question came from somebody who's participating, and it is, despite our advances over time, why do you think prejudice behavior strengthened during the Black Plague as it seems to today during our own pandemic?
I think history and the present are always very messy. So I think we can see ways that it's strengthening, but I can also see ways that we're overcoming it as well. I think you see a number of people who are protesting and resisting the racism and the prejudice that we're seeing. And I do think that humans have a tendency to divide ourselves into different categories of all different kinds, and see us versus them. And when our resources get more restricted or we're feeling more danger, we can strengthen our sense that we're in us who have to oppose them. But I also think history and any context will show you examples of people resisting and fighting against that, and having a broader sense of community with people, and fighting against prejudice as well. And I think we see that now, and we can see that at other points too. But Dr. Rember-Olm's point is that people tend to ignore that aspect of the Middle Ages because people like to tell this fairy tale, essentially. I like fairy tales, but not when it's passing as history. That the Middle Ages was just this cruel and savage time, and they had no intellectual life, and they had no art and all of these things. And then the plague came away and swept that all away, and we have a brand new shiny society that leads us to a more enlightened community. And so that's why she's saying we have to look at the ugliness, we have to look at the hate, and people ignore those aspects. So I think that's her point.
Thank you. That was our only question for now.
Okay, so we can go on to a happier point then. So even when the future looks bleakest, we can be at our best, as 14th century Europe illustrates. Yes, it was a time of great death and devastation and chaos, but it was also a time of remarkable creativity and achievement. I've already referenced Dante and Boccaccio. It was also the time of Chaucer and Wycliffe, as well as two of Christianity's most profound theologians, Catherine of Siena and Julian of Norwich. Both of these women were mystics, or people who have a direct experience of the divine that transforms them and inspires them to try to share some of the wisdom they received from that experience with others. Catherine was born around the year that the plague first struck Italy, and she was a Dominican tertiary, which means she was similar to a nun, but she could interact more freely with the outside world. People from all classes sought her out for her wisdom and guidance, and it was partly due to her that in 1377, the papacy returned to Rome from Avignon in France, where it had been since 1309, and thus was when the plague hit. Catherine's mystical experiences taught her a fairly basic Christian truth that Christ himself is said to give in the Gospel of John, to love one another as Christ loves us. But as many Christians might know this teaching, few live its truth as Catherine did, ceaselessly serving the sick, the condemned, the oppressed, with freely given love, regardless of how those she served might treat her or act towards others. Grace, after all, isn't about love. I mean, it is about love. It's not about merit, it's about love. The word charity, which in Latin is caritas, literally means love. When in 1 John it says that God is love, the word is caritas. And Catherine calls us to live out that love through caring for each other and creation, to embody the love of and for God through our own service of others. Julian is an anchoress, and an anchoress is someone, a woman, anchoress, if it's a man, it's an anchorite, and a person would have to persuade their bishop of two things. One, that they have a genuine lifetime commitment to this way of life, and two, that they have independent financial means so that they won't present an economic burden on their community. And if they persuade their bishop of this, then they will undergo a funerary rite, which declares them dead unto the world and alive unto God. And then they will be walled up in a little room adjacent to a church. Generally, could be out, that'd be more of a hermit thing, but when it's attached to the church, generally it's an anchor hold. And you can see that happening here in this illuminated capital in the bottom right. This is a woman going into this little room where she's going to be walled up for the rest of her life. And she'll have two windows. One is to the outside world, so people can come to her when they're seeking guidance. And then the other window would be onto the church itself, so she could participate in the Mass. And Julie wanted to have a better understanding of Christ's suffering, since it's the means by which he redeemed us, how God showed his love for us, and so how she wanted to show her love for God. So she prayed for great suffering that would help her understand Christ's sacrifice better. And she got her wish with a really horrible disease that put her on her deathbed. And so she received last rites, and the priest came to her to perform last rites, and he held up the crucifix and he said, "Look upon your maker and be saved." And as she looked at that crucifix, Christ came to life in the act of dying. And it's a really wonderful contrast, because she's describing in incredibly brutal detail just how much suffering Christ underwent and what's happening to his body as he's experiencing the suffering, but that this means how greatly he loved us, that how dear we are because he did this for each and every one of us. She envisions the divine as an all-loving figure who allows us to fall so that we'll learn from our mistakes and become better people. She lived in a very turbulent and often devastating period. We have the Black Death, which recurred. It didn't just hit, that's the first wave between 1347 and 1351. It kept coming back, including the year after she received these revelations, and multiple times thereafter. You also have the 100 Years' War between France and England going on. You have the Great Schism, which is, so the Pope, Catherine persuaded the Pope to come back to Rome, and the Pope is really just the Bishop of Rome, so he should be in Rome, but for various reasons, he was in Avignon for most of the 14th century. But he came back in 1377, and he promptly died in 1378, which I think he had help with, but I have no proof for that. So then, as soon as he died, the people in Rome elect a successor, but so do the people in Avignon. And for more than 30 years, you have at least two people who are claiming to be Pope at the same time, which is just devastating for the spiritual authority of the Pope, as well as other things. And you have a bunch of other issues that she's experiencing in the 14th century. But in the midst of this political, socioeconomic, and spiritual unrest, Julian offers a message of hope. She proclaims that each and every one of us is loved and treasured by God, and that God longs for our salvation, our reunion, even more than we do. Her optimism didn't cause her to turn a blind eye to the dire problems facing her contemporaries. She delved into the human condition of her time and found even our worst pain to be an occasion for joy, although it doesn't seem that way to us. She assures her audience that Christ suffers as we suffer, and thus we are never alone in our pain. In those harsh and uncertain times, she wanted us to know God's message, that all will be well. She doesn't mean this in a facile sense. She reminds her audience that we have to actively work towards our own and the world's salvation, but with the confidence that since God is with us, as she firmly believes God to be, we will ultimately triumph over the horrors that 14th century Europe or our 21st century world might throw our way. Julian and Catherine's message parallels the wisdom of Congressman John Lewis, who died this month. In his autobiography, Lewis described the nonviolence training he received, which rested on redemptive suffering. I'm quoting from him. "There is something in the very essence of anguish that is liberating, cleansing, redemptive. I always understood the idea of the ultimate Redeemer, Christ on the cross, but now I was beginning to see that this is something that is carried out in every one of us, that the purity of unearned suffering is a holy and effective thing. It affects not only ourselves, but it touches and changes those around us as well. It opens us and those around us to a force beyond ourselves, a force that is right and moral, the force of righteous truth that is at the basis of human conscience." We are talking about love here, a broader, deeper, more all-encompassing love. It is a love that accepts and embraces the hateful and the hurtful. It is the ability to see through those layers of ugliness, to see further into a person than perhaps that person can see into himself. That is essential to the practice of nonviolence. I'm paraphrasing for a bit. This provides the foundation for building the beloved community, the kingdom of God on earth, which is as inexorable, as irresistible as the flow of the river toward the sea. Wherever it is interrupted or delayed by forces that would resist it, by evil or hatred, by greed, by the lust for power, by the need for revenge, believers in the beloved community insist that it is the moral responsibility of men and women with soul force, people of goodwill, to respond and to struggle nonviolently against the forces that stand between a society and the harmony it naturally seeks. Ending the quote. As Representative Lewis recognized, history isn't just progressive growth, as those who claim that the plague eradicated all the oppressive aspects of medieval culture to pave the way for modernity, the Enlightenment, and Protestantism would have us believe. As Dr. Rumber and Ulm notes, the standard claim that the plague ended feudalism is part of that dangerous and ill-informed oversimplification, yet it was a contributing factor. Surviving serfs, or peasant field laborers, who were tied to manorial estates, were able to increasingly leave the lands of the lords they were tied to and go off to work for other lords who would pay higher wages, increasing financial and social mobility as well as urbanization. Relatedly, the current pandemic has caused increased appreciation for so-called essential workers like cashiers and store clerks, prompting an increase in some of their wages. History is especially hard to analyze when you're living it, however, and it's hard to say where this will lead, especially when, since the start of the pandemic, collective US billionaire wealth has surged by more than $584 billion, while $6.5 trillion in household wealth has disappeared. The US billionaire class saw its wealth climb 20% between March 18th and June 17th, with 29 new billionaires added to the total. The total net worth of the 643 US billionaires climbed from $2.9 trillion to $3.5 trillion. During the same period, 45.5 million Americans filed for unemployment. Possibility isn't inherently good or bad. It depends on what humans make of it. As I often say to my students, people didn't wake up on November 1st, 1517, take a look around and say, oh, we're in early modernity now. These ages are imposed centuries later by those far removed who look back and place a marker. But we're clearly in a time of transition now. Humanity will decide what kind of age it'll be. Some factors are beyond our control, but a great many aren't. Will this age be one that rejects racism and does the work of rooting it out from our institutions, systems, and our own mind? Will it be one that creates a more economically just society so people get paid a living wage and aren't required to literally put their lives on the line for other people's profit, convenience, and comfort? Will it be one that provides our healthcare workers with the resources they need to fight this pandemic and heed scientific advice to lessen the likelihood of this disease spread? Will we at last attain Dr. King's and Representative Lewis's beloved community? I'll leave you to read the news and come to your own conclusions, but I'll end with wisdom from two women who are probably familiar to most of us here today, Jane Goodall and Maya Angelou, reminding us that every day we make a difference and inspiring us to combat our own ignorance that causes us to be part of the problem more than the solution, so that we can learn better and do better. We have more power than we often realize. The question is, how will we use it? So I thank you for your attention, and I will share some of my resources as we take some questions. So do we have more questions, Devin?
We do have another question. Again, if anyone has questions,